Good afternoon, everybody. This is Hunter Mozingo bringing you your daily market insight video for Friday, November 5th, about 5 minutes after market close, 4:06 p.m. Eastern Time here in Jacksonville, Florida. And yes, this is the big show. Yes, we have Don's 21 over 21. We have 4 additions and 4 deletions that we're going to be going over here in just a moment. As well as we're going to look at the biggest winners and the biggest losers from this week. There was some really big winners, some massive gap ups, and conversely, there was some massive gap down, some big time losers. So we're going to look at some of those charts, some of those stocks, as well as look at some of the key levels on the indices, where we're at in regards to moving averages. We're going to look at the dollar. We're going to look at interest rates. And lastly, we're going to look at some of the, maybe a few names that are at good risk reward spots, perhaps. So let's get right into it. So what just happened? Indices finish off the highs. What does that mean? That means that we were much higher earlier in the morning, finished near the lows of the day or in the bottom parts of the range on most of the indices here, most stocks as well, not all, but a good bit. So you can see all major indices still green, the S&P, the Qs, the Dow, the mid caps, and the Russell. G5 slightly red, pretty much strictly due to ARKK being a big laggard today. But S&P up a little over 1/3%, Qs up a little over 0.1%, Dow up a little over 0.5%, mid caps around 0.9, and the Russell up about 1.5. Russell very strong recently as it's been breaking out. I covered that in my most recent video. Some stocks to watch or to keep on your focus list if and as the Russell 2000 tries to break out. It has done that. So we'll check on those 3 stocks. That was Celsius, Matador, and AMBA. We're going to check on those 3 and see how they're doing, since I mentioned that in the previous video. So let's get into it, man. The market state still in an uptrend, no changes there. There's also going to be no changes to the trend gauge. You can see, market leaders, short-term, medium-term, and long-term are bullish. Now, there's no reason to change that. Market conditions and market temperament was very strong this week. However, we are getting a little bit extended. So we're going to look at those charts of the actual indices here in just a moment. Before we do that, as I always do, please allow me to talk about Revere for a quick moment here. I always say this, but I truly mean it. If you have any questions about any of the stocks I cover, any of the strategy or commentary, whatever the case may be, please send me an email. I'd be happy to respond to you. If you're interested in what we do, what our strategy is as a company, what our investment approach is, please send me an email, or you can email anybody here, Dan, Tim, Meryl, Alex, or Don at revereasset.com. So let's look at the charts here. We're going to start with the S&P. I think that is what we normally do. And you can see this has been a very strong move since the 14th, the 13th here. And we have gotten very extended. However, when you look back at the run, say starting in last November, we stayed about 4 to 6, 7% from the 50 on the S&P for quite some time. We're currently about 5. So I feel like this looks extremely extended, but it's not much different than what we saw in this time frame. So the first thing you're going to want to watch on the S&P here and all of these major indices is how they act when they get to this 8-day exponential. You can also look at a 10-day simple. They're usually pretty close to each other. That's kind of the first line in the sand. But the big positive I noticed right before I did the video, as I was looking at the S&P, you see how the 21 is now caught up to the previous high, the 454 area. That's a big plus. So even worst case scenario, we come back, we retest that pivot. At least you've maybe got some additional support there. So the S&P about 5% from the 50, 3% from the 21. That is relatively extended, but keep in mind, we're coming off a period where we were below the moving averages. So these had flattened out quite a bit. Now they're starting to try to leave some of these days off here on the 21. And similarly, we're looking to do that in the coming weeks here with the 50. So the Qs, the key level here on the Qs is going to be 400. You can see how we kind of ran up and tapped it today, came back down. That is somewhat to be expected. First time trying to get through 400. Similar story to what you saw with the S&P. You can see the 21 hooking up pretty swiftly here through the 50. Now we're about 6.5% from the 50-day on the Qs, about 4.5% from the 21. But that is usually an area on the Qs where you want to possibly exercise some caution. So if you look back at the run or just over the course of this year, you can see anytime we got beyond about 7% or so from the 50 on the Qs, that's an area where you might want to be cautious. So keep that in mind. Doesn't mean the market's going to have a big crash or a pullback. It could be a pause. It could be a 2 or 3% pullback over the course of a few weeks. You never know. But it is important to note where we are, and we are a little bit extended right now. So the Dow, not quite so bad. It is a little extended, but not like the Qs or the S&P. So only about 3.5% from the 50, 2% from the 21. You can see we are making new highs here on DIA, but just not with the same velocity that you're seeing on the Qs or on the small caps for that matter. So IWM here. Now, IWM is a little bit different than QQQ and SPY in regards to the moving averages in the sense that this has been really flat all year. Very tight consolidation. I say very tight, very choppy. And it has really started to move. So it may take a little bit more to get those moving averages up and out compared to like the Qs, for example. But nonetheless, IWM, great follow through above 240 today. That's great action. We saw some strength in oils. So IWM acting like you would want it to. Another one that is extended, however, 7.5% from the 50, 5% from the 21. But once again, for small caps, for the S&P and for the Dow in particular, look at how extended they were from November to January, February of this year. So November 2020 to January, February of 2021. This is IWM. You can see a huge breakout following the vaccine announcement, essentially. And we stayed far, far above the 50-day moving average for quite some time here on IWM. So just keep that in mind when you look at some of these. You can use some of this as some of the previous trading here as precedents. Like, for example, this run on IWM, on MBY, on SPY, on DIA. That was when those stocks really started to come to life, because prior to that, it was a lot of the big tech and the growth in early to mid 2020 when we started to come out of COVID. So MBY, excuse me, a little bit ahead of IWM in regards to the breakout, but similar story in regards to extension. About 6.5 or so from the 50, about 4% from the 21, a little less extended than IWM. And then lastly, I think we already covered the Dow. So that's all the major indices. We've also started to see some of these G5 charts really shape up and look well. Here's QQQJ, FFTY. Some of these have come back and started to look very constructive. ARKK is the laggard. Part of that could be due to some of the stocks they've owned or they currently own, some that have gapped down, for example, like Roku. But ARKK, QQQJ, those funds or ETFs are looking much better than they have for the most part of this year. And something that's interesting that I want to show you guys here is to highlight the strength of the market. So IWO hasn't completely broke out yet. It has made a very strong move to get past this 315 area here, 320 area. But you see the strength in IWO, the volume. Well, look at IWN, which is also showing really nice strength, actually breaking out here, making new highs. So it's not like we're seeing the just growth or just value or, you know, just steel or just oil. It's a lot more broad, a lot more breadth in the market at this point in time than we really have seen since the very beginning of this year. So before we get to the actual charts here of individual stocks, let's look at TLT. So you can see a nice little pennant here on TLT, if you will, flag, whatever you want to call it, and a pop out of that. So a strong move for TLT. This was not good for banks, but this is typically good for growth stocks and the more risky, risk-on type of stocks, okay? And so UUP has really not done much. It faded throughout the day, ended up finishing pretty weak, which once again, good for stocks for the most part. But really just kind of in this range right here that we've been in for about the last month. So looking for a decisive move either above this 25.39 area or back down into here towards this 25 area. So UUP really not doing a ton here over the last month, just kind of in a range, but today it did finish weak, and I'll show you a 5-minute chart of UUP so you can kind of see that as the day progressed. So let's get to some of the biggest winners of the week. One that Alex mentioned on the podcast, you'll have to check that out, Dillard's. Big gap up, a lot of retail stocks making huge moves over the course of this week, but a big gap up, wonderful follow through. making a higher high today, right? Getting through this 300 high here and slightly above it today. So Dillard's big move this week, one of the biggest winners of the week. And I apologize, my screen is a little bit frozen on me there. All right. Arista Networks, similar story to Dillard's, a big gap up. We are in earnings season, so it's more common to see these big gap ups and down. But a net big move, very strong, held up very well. On semiconductor, a similar story, big gap up. You can see higher high, higher high, higher high. And then today, maybe a little bit exhausted, maybe a little bit ahead of itself, but pushing through 60 here on ON, on semiconductor. LYV, this is actually a member of the 21/21, so we're going to look at it again, but a massive gap today, making a really strong move this week. SIG, Signet Jewelers, not necessarily a gap up on earnings or anything of the sort, but nonetheless a big move from about 85-ish in here, 90 up to 106, 107, really almost 110 today at one point. So SIG, which has been a quiet winner really since the fall of last year. I mean, you can see this thing was $10, $20 in September, October of last year, and has proceeded to go on a great run. NVIDIA, which is still a holding of Grotection, having a monster move and some monster candles today, as you can see. Pretty massive move here, gap up, and then another gap. We were up almost close to 20% at one point here on this day, the high of 313.65, and then today putting in a nice candle. Actually, it has gotten a little volatile, but nonetheless, NVIDIA having a really big week. A couple more big winners here, just a few. SQM doing really well, while some of the other chemical agriculture names like Nutrien and Mosaic had really bad weeks. SQM having a really great week with volume. Not sure what's going on here. I'll have to do some digging to see if there's some news or something, but this is massive, massive volume pushing this thing up to a breakout here. And then lastly, some of the best sectors of the week would have been SOX, the semiconductor ETF here. Big time breakout, big time strength. You see the volume. And then XRT, I mentioned the retail sector breaking out. You can see that on the chart there too, getting through that 99.24 pivot back up now above 100. So those are two of the strongest sectors. Before we go to some of the big losers, let's check on those three stocks I covered earlier in the week. Celsius, a smaller name, it's continued nicely, really kind of respecting the 8 here over the last 4 or 5 days. Matador, I actually bought this in my tracking portfolio yesterday, added a little bit to it today. Acting well off the 21 here, not any kind of big volume, but a pretty normal consolidation here on the 21 after a huge move. And lastly, AMBA, which is our biggest holding in Grow. I own it in the tracking portfolio, acting very, very well, respecting the 8-day. The one caveat here with AMBA, something we noted today, is it's the first lower low versus the prior day it's made in about 3 weeks. So may mean nothing, could mean something. We'll see how next week plays out. But those are the three. They've all continued and acted well. Let's look at some of the big losers for the week. We'll go through these quickly. Chegg, massive gap down from 115 earlier this year in February to $30 now. Zillow, a huge gap. We actually talk about this in pretty good detail on the podcast. Please check it out if you want more. But similar story, from 208 in February to $66 now. Peloton, also a big gap down on earnings, down 36% today from 171 to 55. Same, just brutal charts in some of these names here. Moderna hit with some bad news from Pfizer today regarding a COVID pill, basically. They were down big this week, as you can see there below the 200-day. BNTX, BioNTech is the same kind of looking chart. Penn also getting some negative headlines, as well as earnings up today, but down like 22% yesterday from 142 to now 61, cut in half here on Penn. And then lastly, Activision Gaming, also a pretty brutal, nasty gap down from 104 now to 68. So like I said, some big losers, some big gap downs. It's certainly out there. Now let's talk about the 21 over 21. And we're going to start here. I'm trying not to squeeze these charts up too much. We're going to start with the removals, and then we're going to talk about the additions. So MOS, Mosaic, just reported earnings this week and subsequently has not been able to hold the 21. We do see an effort to reclaim the 50. We'll see if that ends up being a good thing. Maybe it can fill this gap here, get back up to this 38.40 level. I'll keep a close eye on that. I'm actually going to set an alert here at 38.20, just in the event that it starts to climb back up. But MOS obviously below the 21 after the earnings coming off the list. These chemical agriculture names have a tendency to go to the 50. As you can see at the chart, they sometimes respect the 21, sometimes don't. But nonetheless, coming off of the 21 over 21 list. Apps, another one that had a really rough week. Big gap down on earnings, down about 15–20%, and is now below the 50 and below the 200-day. Like you can see here, well below the 21. Although the numbers theoretically look great, the market did not like it, so it has come off the list. Let me slide this over a little bit. CrowdStrike, although it closed more or less right on it, I apologize, I feel like this is super squeezed up, but right on that green line, it really closed about right on it, but we actually removed CrowdStrike. There's a better alternative in the same industry group that looks much stronger, respecting the moving averages much better. And lastly, Goldman Sachs, same kind of thing as Crowd, closed right about on it, just a little bit below it, but not really giving it much margin for error, taking it off. So 4 names coming off. What are the 4 names going on? First one, Zscaler. I mentioned there was an alternative to Crowd that looked much better. This is that alternative, as you can see, respecting the 8 as opposed to slicing back down into the 50 and the 21. Zscaler has been a quiet leader in this space and has a tendency to go on these lockout moves. You can see it went on one here and just had a great run. So Zscaler, very strong, now added to the 21 over 21. The next one is a gap up name from today. If I can get my MarketSmith to cooperate with me here. Airbnb, big time gap up about 13%. This was actually down to about 167 after hours yesterday. I own this in the tracking portfolio. And so I was watching and listening and whatnot. It turned around very quickly. It went from about 167 to 185 in a quick fashion after hours. And then this morning was up closer to 190 and then followed throughout the day. So a nice day from Airbnb, added to the 21 over 21 after a big gap on big volume. The most volume it's seen, I believe, since this day here. So quite some time. Airbnb trying to, get back above 200 and stay above 200. And we got a few more here. One in crypto land, Coin. This one has been respecting the 8 beautifully, although it is quite a vertical move. It is acting just like you would want it to. It hasn't even sliced through it yet. It does have earnings, I believe, on the 9th, as you can see here. But Coin acting very well. Some of these IPOs that struggled or failed off the rip kind of in the beginning of this year have went through a tough time, like Airbnb, like Coin, like Unity Software is another example. Some of those have started to come back to life and build the right side of their base, possibly on the way to try to make a run at these previous highs, that type of thing. So Coin added to the 21 over 21. And another example of what I just talked about, Snow, added to the 21 over 21 as well, looking like it's on a path to challenge this 429 previous high here. So respecting the 8-day after this consolidation here near the 50, near this 300 level, Snow added to the 21, acting great, just like a leading stock should act here. So those are the 4 additions and the 4 deletions. Let's go over the remaining 21 over 21 list here. So SI, we actually sold this in Grotection this week, got out of it, took some nice gains, very extended, very, very strong move, but just taking some gains here on something that was very extended. No, it stays in the 21 over 21 though, because this is one of the strongest stocks in crypto land and in the market as a whole. Tesla, another great week for Tesla, as you can see, up over 1,200 now. Obviously, yes, it is extended, but this is the strongest stock in the market at least the strongest stock, liquid stock, big liquid stock in the market, undoubtedly. And just as so you know, as we're going through these are sorted by distance from, excuse me, the 21-day. So in phase, this one is acting absolutely wonderful after a huge gap. I actually started a very small 1 to 1.5% position on in phase in my tracking portfolio after this gap around the 235 area. I'm interested to see if it can respect the 8. Right now, it's not really giving much up at all. You can see making higher lows as it moves along here. LYV, I touched on this one earlier, a big gap up today, but now it's very extended. It is above the 21, yes, but now we're 22% above the 21-day exponential, roughly 20%. But a big gap with big volume today, the most volume we've seen in a while here on LYV, and continuing to move higher. It's something we've seen some of. Another one that gapped up was Datadog, right? So we've seen where these stocks that are at new recent highs or new 52-week highs continuing to move higher or having another gap, right? So this is what happened with Datadog. They had a gap here, led to this run in here, and then another gap today. Team was like that not very long. So Datadog still on the 21/21 list. Airbnb, we talked about the big gap up today. Ethereum, same story, looks very, very good. Like most of the crypto stocks do. You could look at Bitcoin, you could look at Ethereum, you can look at some of the crypto miners, you can look at Coinbase. These look very good for the time being. BILL, Bill, big gap up today, up about 15%, give or take a little bit. Not massive volume, but this thing has a tendency to gap up, as you can see, 1, 2, 3 gap ups in the last year or last 9 months, really. So I think this is now the third gap up in the last 9 months for Bill, which not a bad thing considering what price has done. So Bill staying on the 21/21. I talked about Coin. Net recently reported earnings, actually yesterday afternoon, I believe, was actually up about 4 or 5% at one point today and ended up finishing slightly down, maybe a little bit ahead of itself. This thing has been on quite the move, very vertical, as you can see, but still staying on the 21/21 as it should. This is one of the true leaders in the market. I talked about Zscaler. DXCM, one of our newer positions, handling out nicely after this big 10% up day, acting just like you would want it to here. Still pretty extended after this sharp move up here, but just doing exactly what you'd like for it to do after a strong move like that, digesting it beautifully. AMBA, I talked about just a moment ago, respecting the 8-day, maybe having a little bit of trouble with this 200 area. Not an expectation breaker. It's something that you are accustomed to seeing as you get into these. You start looking at stocks, they have trouble with the 200 and the 100 the first time they get there, that kind of thing. SU continues its move, bounced off the 8, acting well. Dutch Bros actually reversed off the 21 today. It's really encouraging action. That's what you want to see. Now you want to see if it can get back above the 8 or maybe even consolidate a little bit here on the 21. We talked about Snowflake being added. Affirm was down earlier today on news, or basically in sympathy with Peloton's bad numbers. They bounced off the 8-day, ended up being down 2.5% on very light volume. Nothing to complain about. New core slightly green today, staying above the moving averages, keeping this uptrend intact. SBNY, similar story, above the moving averages, keeping the uptrend intact. CBRE has gotten back above the moving averages. This was a recent buy for us, but back above the 8 and trending in the right direction. And then JBHT also, although it was rejected at 200 again today, staying above the 21. So that is the entire 21/21. That was the big winners and the big losers. And I did mention a couple of names that I thought were at reasonable risk reward spots. I would say Matador would be maybe my number one. I like the estimates. I like that earnings are behind it. I also like Fang. Fang is just a little bit more extended. Maybe that means it's stronger, but Fang and Matador are two to keep on your list if the oil, excuse me, the oil market can really get going again. So that wraps it up for me today, everybody. I hope you all have a great weekend. Please tune into the podcast. And otherwise, I will see you on Monday's video. Thanks, everybody.